Hi there, I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news agency. You can find us online at www.cruxnow.com, that is cruxnow.com, and a fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to another edition of the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. In this episode, as always, I am going to give you the story and then the rest of the story. So the story is this. The opening days of October, for that matter, the last day of September, have been another momentous period in the Pope Francis papacy. There are three high-profile things that have been going on at Rome this week, which collectively have the potential to reshape the Catholic Church in important ways for a long time to come. And so I'm going to break down each one of those for you, and then if you stick around for the rest of the story, I will unpack them. Issue number one. On Monday, the final day of September in 2019, Pope Francis held a private audience with one of the most famous Catholic priests in America, Jesuit Father James Martin. James Martin is a contributing editor at America Magazine. He is the author of a number of books, a popular speaker on the Catholic lecture circuit. But undoubtedly, Jim Martin is best known as the foremost advocate in the United States of a more pastoral, tolerant, sort of forgiving approach in outreach and ministry with LGBTQ Catholics. Now, Father Martin has long been a controversial figure for exactly that reason. There is a not insignificant number of American bishops who have raised questions about what some of them see as the ambiguity of some of the language he uses in terms of traditional church teaching about marriage and human sexuality and so on. On the other hand, he tends to be extraordinarily popular with the secular media and with what one might think of as the more moderate to liberal wing of the Catholic Church in terms of these issues. And in any event, the decision by Pope Francis to invite Father Martin for an audience, because that's how this broke. This is not something that Father Martin requested. It is something that the Pope himself initiated. That decision obviously is intended to send a signal of support for Father Martin in a way that has already been, and no doubt will continue to be, controversial in some Catholic circles. Now, at the same time this week, we have a high-profile event taking place here in Rome, sponsored by the United States Embassy to the Holy See. The ambassador to the Holy See is Callista Gingrich, the wife of former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. She is, of course, Donald Trump's envoy to the Vatican. The relationship between the Vatican and the White House in the era of both Pope Francis and Donald Trump has obviously been well chronicled. Largely, it has to be said, in terms of the differences between these two figures, especially when it comes to issues such as immigration, climate change, anti-poverty efforts. But the event that is taking place today here in the Vatican, sponsored by the U.S. Embassy, is devoted to an area in which the two men and the institutions they represent actually more or less agree, which is the promotion of religious freedom around the world. So it is going to be fascinating to see if common ground can be found. And certainly the right people are on hand for it. The American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, will be here to deliver the opening remarks. And the Vatican Secretary of State, Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, will be on hand to deliver the close. So that is another event that Vatican watchers have their eyes on. And, of course, this week is also the pregame, so to speak, to the opening of the October 6th to the 27th Synod of Bishops on the Amazon on Sunday. There are a number of what you might think of as counter events going on this week in Rome, both from the left and the right, all intended to help shape in some way the discussion inside and outside the Synod of Bishops. It's almost as if, to be honest with you, this is Super Bowl week in Rome, where, the real issue are who's hosting the biggest parties, who's on the guest list, and whose comments are going to generate the most buzz on social media, in the papers, on TV, and so on. To sum it all up, it is a huge week here in Rome. One of those weeks in which you can almost feel the tectonic plates of the church realigning in some significant ways. We're going to bring it to you all on Crux. I will bring it to you here on the John Allen Show. And so I invite you to stick around with me now for the rest of the story.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
So, the rest of the story is this. Let us begin with this fairly remarkable private audience that Pope Francis conducted with Jesuit Father James Martin. Now, Jim Martin has been a fixture of the American Catholic landscape for a long time. He is a wildly popular speaker in a number of Catholic venues around the country, such as the annual Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, which is the largest annual gathering of Catholics in North America. He was, for some time, informally the chaplain to the Colbert Show on the Comedy Channel, and a kind of fixture of American network television. He has written a number of very popular and best-selling books, and on and on. His reputation, however, largely is being the country's foremost advocate, Catholic advocate, one should say, of a more embracing, understanding, and positive pastoral approach to members of the Catholic community who are also LGBTQ, that is, who are gays, lesbians, transgender, and so on. Now, that position has brought fire from some in church authority and outside it. Some believe that Father Martin does not give an adequate defense of classic Catholic doctrine on marriage, which is that marriage is between a union between a man and a woman for life, and that anything short of that, including so-called gay marriage, doesn't meet the test. There are also some who believe that the Church's traditional teaching on human sexuality, which is that sexuality is licit only in the context of monogamous heterosexual marriage, and that any expression of human sexuality outside of that therefore falls short of the moral mark. Some feel that Father Martin does not give adequate witness to those principles of church doctrine. And it is inevitable that whenever Father James Martin speaks someplace in the United States, there will be protests, either physical protests, that is, people actually showing up at the talk to object to it, or at least you will hear protests in social media and so on. He is, in other words, the dictionary definition of a polarizing figure. He is a hero to some and a cautionary tale to others. Now, obviously, Pope Francis, whatever else one wants to say about him, Pope Francis is not a naif. He is not unaware of the political register of what he says and does. And so by choosing to reach out to Father Martin, to invite him to this private audience while Father Martin happened to be in Rome, and then allowing news of that private audience to be broadcast hither and yon, Pope Francis obviously intends to send a signal of support. Now, what will the repercussions of that be? Well, in the short term, it may make it easier for Father Martin to appear in official Catholic venues around the country, although honestly, there have been relatively few examples when that has been problematic for him. Certainly, it may discourage some in officialdom, from lodging objections, lodging complaints, going public with their concerns about Father Martin. But the wider ramifications are that Father James Martin is merely the most prominent example of a larger community of people within the church who have quietly been trying to do ministry and outreach to LGBTQ Catholics for some time. And no doubt the news that Pope Francis has, in a sense, wrapped Jim Martin in a warm, loving embrace is going to embolden those efforts. Of course, for critics of the Pope, really, this simply becomes another plank in the indictment. And honestly, it's probably not as if they needed additional raw material. And so it is another chapter of Pope Francis simply not being cowed by his critics. Another kind of pope might think, geez, I know I am already a controversial figure. I know that the divisions in the church are becoming stronger. I myself recently floated during an airborne press conference the idea of a schism in the church. Perhaps this is not a moment to put my foot in the gas, but that is not Pope Francis's style. When he believes an important matter of principle is at stake, he acts, and he is not afraid to do so in full public view. And obviously, this meeting with Father Martin is another case in point. All right, so the second major event on the docket in Rome this week is the Conference on Religious Freedom being sponsored by the Embassy to the Holy See, that is the American Embassy to the Vatican. 2019 is the 35th anniversary, actually, of the launch of official diplomatic relations between the United States and the Vatican, which happened under President Ronald Reagan in 1984. This one is devoted to religious freedom. It is, in a sense, a follow-up from what's called a ministerial, which in diplomatic speak means a kind of high-level conference in which foreign ministers and the ministers of governments come together to discuss a particular issue. This ministerial was sponsored by the U.S. State Department and Secretary of State Pompeo in Washington on religious freedom. And so this is a sort of continuation of that event. It involves Secretary of State Pompeo coming not only to speak at this conference, but to have a private meeting with the Vatican's foreign minister, British Archbishop Paul Gallagher, and also to meet with Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who is the Vatican's Secretary of State. Now, of course, everyone knows the backdrop to all of this, which is that relations between the Trump White House and the Vatican of Pope Francis have been, to put it politely, somewhat checkered. You may remember that when Donald Trump was on the campaign trail, there was a famous moment in which Pope Francis visited the U.S.-Mexico border, and on the way back to Rome from that trip, he was asked about candidates who proposed building walls along that border, and his famous response was, "Such a man is not a Christian," which many people at the time took to be a fairly direct slam on then candidate Donald Trump. Pope Francis and his team have criticized the Trump administration for their decision to withdraw from the Paris climate change agreements. They have continued to criticize the Trump administration on matters of immigration policy. They have been critical of the arms trade in which many American defense contractors who support the Trump administration are big players, and on and on. The Francis papacy has also been very critical of the practice of the death penalty in the United States. So the catalog of areas in which these two administrations disagree is, frankly, fairly extensive. Now, as it happens, however, this week puts them in a space in which there is at least the intriguing possibility of finding common ground, and that is the promotion of religious freedom around the world. The Trump administration has seized upon religious freedom, and in particular, anti-Christian persecution, as a core element of American foreign policy abroad. Particularly, Vice President Mike Pence has been very outspoken about the importance of defending persecuted Christians and persecuted followers of other religions. Also on hand for Wednesday's event here at the Vatican will be the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, the former governor of Kansas, who is also an advocate for persecuted Christians and persecuted followers of other religions. So the United States is, in a way, deploying its A-list diplomatic personnel for this event. On the Vatican side, the promotion of religious freedom has been a core element of Catholic social teaching really since the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s and the document Nostra Aetate. Pope Francis, in particular, has made a point of defending persecuted followers of other religions, whether it is the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, a country Pope Francis visited, or persecuted Muslims in other parts of the world, other countries that Pope Francis has visited, or in particular, persecuted Christians. Pope Francis has made reference on multiple occasions to the staggering number of new martyrs in Christianity today. He has spoken eloquently of what he sees as an ecumenism of blood. That is, that the persecutors of Christians don't make denominational distinctions for the most part. And so those denominational distinctions perhaps ought not to be as important to us as they have been historically in the quest for Christian unity. So it is entirely possible that two of the most polarizing, yes, but also charismatic and consequential figures in the world, that is Pope Francis and President Donald Trump, could find a meeting of minds on the back of this extraordinary summit that's unfolding in Rome here today as we speak. And should that happen, we should not discount the possibilities. It is, of course, true that part of the context for the launching of formal diplomatic relations between the United States and the Vatican in the mid-1980s was the common cause that then President Ronald Reagan and then Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul, had in the struggle against Soviet communism. And we remember that when the world's preeminent soft power in the Vatican and the world's preeminent hard power in the United States came together in that crusade against communism, the history of the world changed. Now, I don't know that anyone is predicting something quite so dramatic out of Wednesday's conference in the Vatican's old Synod Hall on religious freedom. But nevertheless, the memory of that remarkable confluence of the sacred and the secular is still there, and it creates the deeply intriguing possibility that something momentous might result this week as well. Finally, the curtain is about to go up on the much anticipated Synod of Bishops for the Amazon, which will run here in Rome October 6th through the 27th. It is a gathering of about 300 bishops and other church leaders, principally from the 9 Latin American nations that share some part of the Amazon. The largest number, of course, come from Brazil, because 60% of the Amazon is within the borders of Brazil. Now, this synod has been generating interest and controversy well before it began. On an odd intra basis, there is concern about what this synod might say about the so-called viri probati, the idea of ordaining tested married men as Catholic priests to serve isolated rural communities in the Amazon, particularly the roughly 400 communities of indigenous persons who are scattered across the Amazon rainforest. For fans of that proposal, it is a long overdue pastoral accommodation to serve an oft-neglected population. For critics, it is a Trojan horse that could end with the de facto abolition of clerical celibacy in the Latin Church. So we are expecting considerable ferment and discussion around that issue. Another odd intra issue that is going to be very hot is the question of what does mission, what does evangelization look like in the 21st century? Is the battle against climate change, for instance, and to save the rainforest, is that a distraction from saving souls or necessary prolegomena to it? And we will, I think, hear some very lively debate around that question. From an ad extra point of view, things that will interest the outside world. This synod is coming on the heels of a series of thousands of devastating fires that ravaged the Amazon this summer. And I think the extent to which the Catholic Church is prepared to become, in a sense, the global chaplain of the effort against climate change, against deforestation, and in favor of saving the Amazon, that's something that I think will perk up eyes and ears around the world, certainly well beyond the borders of the Catholic Church. Now, as one sign of the ferment around this synod, this is one of the most extraordinary pre-game weeks in recent Roman memory. It would seem that every organization inside and outside the Catholic Church that has a stake in this conversation is here in one way, shape, or form. Yesterday, Tuesday, an organization called Voices of the Faith, which is an organization dedicated to women's issues in the Catholic Church and advancing the role of women in the Catholic Church, held a press conference at Rome's Foreign Press Club to complain that while men, including at least one non-ordained man, will be able to cast votes in this Synod of Bishops, no women will be, and their objection is that that isn't fair, and it's going to produce a skewed view of what the overall reaction of the Church is to these issues. They are also going to be holding a couple of demonstrations, so they will be part of the soundtrack to Synod 2019. Later this week, on October 4th, a group of American, Canadian, English-speaking, more traditional and conservative Catholic activists will be holding a symposium with the provocative title, The Church Reformed or Deformed, raising a question mark about the course of the Francis papacy. That's going to figure some of Francis's best-known critics, such as Michael Voris of Church Militant and John Henry Weston of LifeSite News. The next day, a more Italian-speaking symposium is going to be convened. That, among other things, will feature a member of the Brazilian royal family who has written a very skeptical book about the ecology movement and the fight against climate change that has actually been cited favorably by Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. So that will also be raising some critical questions about this Synod. There is also going to be a public prayer for the soul of the Church taking place in Rome. Rosaries are going to be prayed as the Synod opens. And all of this is part of the sights and sounds in Rome in the countdown to Sunday, when the clock actually starts ticking and those 300 church leaders begin deliberating. It is obviously going to be fascinating to track the discussions both inside and outside the Synod and how they play with the various stakeholders who perceive themselves to be, in some sense, concerned with, involved in, motivated, and driven by these discussions. All of that will be tracked for you on the Crux site. Again, that is cruxnow.com. We are also going to be following it here on the John Allen Show, sponsored by the Word on Fire Institute, of which I am a proud fellow. So until we speak again, stay tuned, read Crux, keep following the Word on Fire website, and have a fantastic and blessed week.